I'm Judith Kroll. I'm a faculty member here at University of California, Riverside. I'm a cognitive psychologist, which from some perspectives may seem like an unusual contribution to this meeting, but I'm very, very honored to be included and happy to participate. I'm going to talk today about language learning from a U.S. perspective. More people in the world are bilingual than monolingual, but until very recently, most research on language and cognition in the United States examined only monolingual speakers of a single language and typically speakers of English as the native language. Bilinguals were considered to be a special population, one that complicated the study of language, the mind, and the brain. There was mythology about second language learning and about bilingualism. More than a decade ago, on the 125th anniversary of the journal Science, Kennedy and Norman wrote an editorial in which they identified the biological basis of second language learning as one of the top 125 questions to be answered in the next 25 years of research in all of science. And this is very important to point out, that this is in all of science. It's really quite remarkable. And what you see here is a graph taken from the Web of Science, which plots the number of articles published on bilingualism between 1993 and 2012. And what you can see is that there's been a virtual explosion of research. There's been an upsurge of research on bilingualism. In part, that upsurge, I would argue, reflects a new attitude about bilingualism, that the language and learning sciences have come to see that bilingualism is a tool for revealing the workings of language, the mind, and the brain. Now, if you read the media, you read that bilingualism is good for you. We hear a lot in the press about the benefits of bilingualism, that bilingualism is good for the brain, that bilingualism may be a mental gymnasium for the brain, juggling languages can build better brains. But the question I want to ask today is whether that perspective is appreciated in the U.S. The map that you see here is from some research by Gigi Luck's group at Harvard School of Education, looking at the perceived social value of bilingualism in different regions of the United States. And what you can see, if you look at the color of the map itself, is you see the percentage of non-English use at home. And the blue that really dominates the map is a very, very tiny percent. And so what you see between 0 and 9% of homes in the US, in this blue region that covers the country, use a language other than English at home. And what we see in these other colors is you see that as you come to the red, you see an increasing percentage of non-English in the home. And for those of us who are in Southern California, you might take this as a very positive sign, and you see that we have a lot of representation in the red areas of the map, and then there are pockets within the United States and Texas and parts of the Southwest where you see that in fact there are quite a few non-English speakers. And the idea in the study they did was to try to get data on what people in these different areas of the country think about how valuable it is to speak a language other than English or in addition to English. And what they found was that the perceived social value of bilingualism, of using more than one language, was a function of whether or not you lived in a location where there was language diversity. That in locations where there were many bilinguals, where the native language, the L1, was not necessarily English, or where there were multiple L1s and many bilingual individuals, people perceived bilingualism to be a valuable, good thing. As we go down the arrow here, you see that what happens is that as you go to locations in the country where people have maybe tried to learn a second language or haven't even tried to learn a second language, that this function drops off. And so what you see is that there is an effect of linguistic diversity on the perceived bilingualism, the value of bilingualism in this country. Now, in 2016, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences published a report on a very important commission on language learning. This was the first commission that had been done in something like 30 years, looking at the status of language learning in the United States. And the conclusion that they reached from this report is that English is no longer sufficient as a lingua franca, neither at home or abroad, and that we in the United States need to take much more seriously the status of language learning and our commitment to language learning and to dual language use. I want to start today by reviewing some of the statistical findings in that report because they're really quite striking and informative. And I recommend the website to you. The website has lots of information and many documents that are informative about the situation in the United States from a number of different perspectives. So this is a pie chart that shows you the percentage or the number of people in the United States aged 5 and over who actually speak English only, and that is the big blue area here. The dark portion of the chart are people who speak a language other than English but not well, and the lighter blue portion are people who speak a language other than English well. And so what you can see is that the majority of the U.S. only speak English, and the majority of people in the U.S. Who speak another language tend not to necessarily speak it at a very high level of proficiency. We can look at very similar kind of data from sort of a percentage perspective and ask about what languages are spoken. And what you can see here is that close to 80% of the U.S. speaks English only. And then we have a portion, almost 13% speak Spanish. And then we have smaller percentages associated with many different languages. We can ask the question, where the people who live in the United States and who are fluent in another language acquired that other language? How did they come to be bilingual or second language speakers? And what you can see here is that, again, this large blue portion says childhood home. 75.5% of the people who have a language other than English learned it at home. And 8.2% learned it elsewhere, and only 16.3% learned it at school, which I think is a very surprising statistic. So if most children are getting the non-English language exposure at home, what happens in school? This is, again, a map of the United States, and it is for students who are in kindergarten through 12th grade, so both primary and secondary school students, who are enrolled in language courses other than English, and this is by state. And what you can see is that the states that are in white, you have less than 13% of all students enrolled in both primary and secondary school are actually enrolled in language courses other than English. And I think that statistic is rather shocking. It's both depressing and shocking. So what happens is that the percentage increases as the representation becomes darker. And so you can see that there are some pockets in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and places on the East Coast where there is a healthier percentage. But before we become too smug about that, notice that it barely goes above 50%, 51.2. So in other words, we have very few places in the United States where students who are in primary and secondary school are likely to be receiving education in another language. And we can ask, those of us who live in Southern California, where we have much greater linguistic diversity, can ask the question about what the status of language use is here. And these are data from Southern California. And these are data where individuals are evaluated on 4 of the major language skills. So this is understanding, speaking, reading, and writing. And what you have in these different colored bars are the generations. So blue is first generation, so not born in the US, came to the US as a child. And then the yellow are second generation, and so forth and so on. And the main point on all of these different language skills is what you see is a dramatic drop-off. What we're measuring here is the extent to which the person considers themselves to use a non-English language well. And so the farther along you are in these generations, what we see is the less likely you are to be using a language other than English. Now, there may be some hope and some cause for optimism. In 2016, we had an election in the United States that was fairly wretched, but we have one glimmer of hope in California, which is that there was a proposition on the 2016 ballot. It was a proposition about dual language education, and it was a proposition that proposed that non-English language instruction could be used much more liberally in educational instruction. And what we see on this ballot is that this proposal passed by a very wide margin, so over 73%. And so in California, people voted for the idea that we should be encouraging dual language education. Now, a side comment that I'm not going to get into right now is that we may not have a sufficient number of teachers and instructors who are able to carry out that, that sort of optimistic plan. But what we see some suggestion that there is interest in trying to encourage this. And what happens in the dual language context? Is there any reason for optimism there? Absolutely. This is another graph from the American Academy report showing that the number of months students in dual language immersion programs, and these tend to be primary school children, are ahead of their peers in monolingual classrooms is really quite dramatic. So these are non-English language speaking children coming to school and acquiring skills in academic skills and English language skills. And what we see is that the dual language children who are immersed in this dual language environment actually end up doing better in English. And that happens in the 5th grade, but it happens quite dramatically by the 8th grade. And so what that suggests is that dual language immersion can really be a solution to increasing proficiency in both languages. And what about university students? Well, in the American Academy report, we see that there's really a rather low and somewhat pathetic rate of students in primary and secondary school taking second language courses. What about university students? These are data on study abroad. What happens to university students when they have study abroad experiences? And what happens to their ability to use the second language? And what we see is on here we're looking at speaking, reading, and listening. And this is the blue is before and the post is after. And so after an immersed study abroad program, university students are significantly better at using the second language, suggesting that there is hope also, even for students who may not have necessarily had exposure to the second language while they were younger and in primary or secondary school. So the conclusion of the American Academy report is that a wiser, more forward-thinking strategy would be to steadily improve access to as many languages as possible for people of every age, ethnicity, and socioeconomic background, to treat language education as a persistent national need like competency in math or English, and to ensure that a useful level of proficiency is within every student's reach. So the question that we want to ask, given the statistics that I've shown you, is whether this is possible in the United States in this context. And why are the statistics so grim? Well, one argument is the statistics are grim because we in our country hold a lot of mythology about bilingualism. and about dual language use. We have the idea that young babies exposed to two languages may be confused, that mixing two languages may be a sign of low proficiency and perhaps even pathology, that children raised in a home language other than English should be switched to English as quickly as possible, that the human brain may have evolved to speak only one language, speaking two or more languages is complicated and maybe abnormal, and that studying a foreign language as an adult is a waste of time. These are all myths, and I'm going to come back to the myths in a moment, but I want to argue today that the same mythology may in fact exist in other places in the world, but in the consequences that the mythology holds in this U.S. context may be particularly harmful. And so we need to ask ourselves, what can we do? What can be done? And what I'm going to do today, very quickly in my remaining time, is to try to illustrate a couple of things that I think we can do that might address this issue. First, we can conduct research on second language learning and bilingualism that produces findings that might be used to counter the mythology. Second, we can try to translate the basic research to practice, to communicate the findings of our science to the larger public. We can also embrace language learning and study abroad as sources of engaged scholarship for university students who have come of age in this English-only context. So I'm going to start considering each of these points by giving you some illustrative research findings. And I'll say that we do research on second language learning and bilingualism. We look at how second language learning and bilingualism affect the mind and the brain. I'm only going to be able to give you the tiniest snippet of a feeling for what this research is showing. So what does this upsurge of research on second language learning and bilingualism reveal that might be used to effectively counter the mythology? Well, what you have on the left is that graph that I showed you earlier about how there's an increasing amount of research on this topic. And what you have on the right is from an article that was about how being bilingual changes the architecture of your brain. So what have we learned in this period of time? What we've learned is there is far greater adult plasticity than previously understood, that language learning occurs at all ages, that language learning occurs for multiple languages at all ages, even for individuals who are older. We've also learned that there are consequences of bilingualism, so that proficient bilinguals may not be exactly like monolingual speakers, even in their native language. And so the idea is that the two languages come to interact with one another in ways that produce competition. Competition always sounds like a bad thing, that competition, we're going to sort of beat each other out. But that what we have come to learn is that competition between two languages is a normal process that happens as the two languages come to reside in the same language system in a person's mind and brain. And it's that very competition and its consequences that may produce benefits to bilinguals and second language learners as they become proficient. And that process appears to begin in early infancy and extends to old age. The examples on the slide are an example from a very exciting study that this infant here is in a harmless device. It doesn't look very harmless, but it's a MEG procedure to look at the brains of 11-month-old babies. And what this is a study from Patricia Kroll's lab at University of Washington. And what the study shows is that these tiny little babies who are exposed to more than one language from birth are beginning to develop speech systems that are more open to all languages. Their system is more open than those of monolingually acquiring babies. And moreover, that their brains are beginning to show evidence that the area of the brain that seems to be involved in cognitive decision making and all of the sort of positive benefits that we might expect if you're learning to really negotiate two different systems begin to be tuned even as early as 11 months. So these are very, very exciting findings. Now the second article is an article by Thomas Bach and Antonella Sirachi and their group in Edinburgh. And this is a language learning study where they introduce a sort of intensive language learning course to people over a short period of time. And here's the remarkable result. What they look at is they look at the cognitive attentional gains that people experience when they have intensive language learning. And what you see is that people benefit from intensive language learning relative to learning other kinds of skills. And moreover, what happens with these people is that you even see this for people who are old. So this is not just for young college students. This is not just for young adults or even middle-aged adults. You even see new learning occurring when individuals are older. And so the question is, how does this happen? And we have argued that there are three primary discoveries about bilingualism that shape the research agenda and that tell us something about how these changes occur. One, which I've mentioned already, is that both languages are always active and competing. It's very counterintuitive to individuals who are sometimes highly proficient in two languages that, in fact, at a level that may not be conscious to you, the other language that you're not using at a given moment in time may also be available. The two languages come online at the same time. The second observation is that the native language changes in response to learning and using a second language. And for people who believe strongly in English only, this may be a little bit threatening. The idea that your native language may actually be modified by interacting with another language. We're going to argue that this is a very typical, normal part of new learning. So proficient bilinguals can speak their native language well, proficiently, fluently, but in fact they speak it a little bit differently than monolingual speakers do. And the final discovery is that being bilingual, using two languages over the course of your life, has the effect of reorganizing structures in your brain and brain networks that control the way you may negotiate your world cognitively, even outside of language, in a way that's more effective. So I want to very briefly try to illustrate these points and ask the question of how do the minds and brains of bilinguals accommodate themselves to having two languages present. This is an example of a Dutch English speaker in the Netherlands. This object, a bicycle, is a very, very common object. And a person who is a Dutch English bilingual has at least two ways, and maybe more ways, of naming this object. And asking someone just to name a picture, like the picture of the bicycle, is a really simple thing to do. A young child could say, oh, that's a bike. In Dutch, the word for bike is fiets. And the point of this illustration is that even for something as simple as choosing whether it's bike or fiets, you're making a choice. The bilingual is always having to make a choice to figure out which language he or she is going to speak. And one argument, one hypothesis, is that decision making that's always involved when you're using two languages may really come to have positive consequences for how well you're able to make decisions in general. So what we can think of is we can think that this juggling of the two languages is really creating a constant activity that changes the native language as well as the second language, and that tunes the brain networks that enable cognitive control. So that all of this competition and juggling may be difficult at one level when you're first learning the language. It may be difficult in some situations, but in general, what it does is to produce benefits. So how does learning a second language create these changes? Well, the truth is that there are many, many ways that this happens. But for the purpose of this talk today, and given my time restrictions, I'm going to only illustrate one of them that I think is very important to language education. And that has to do with what happens to learners when they are studying abroad. What happens to learners when they're immersed in a second language environment, when they're studying abroad or traveling? And what we've learned is that when you're studying abroad or traveling, we see a suppression of your native language. And again, at one level, that sounds like it might be a bad thing. And what we've come to see is that that may be a really critical aspect of new learning, because when you suppress your native language to be able to use a second language, what's happening is that you're learning to regulate the two languages in a really skillful way. So I'm going to illustrate this with one study that we've done, looking at what happens when American college students are doing a study abroad. This is a study that took place in Salamanca, Spain, and at Penn State University, where I was formerly on the faculty. And what we did is we looked at college students who were intermediate learners of Spanish. They were all native English speakers. They were either in the classroom at Penn State or they were on a study abroad experience in Salamanca. And we wanted to ask the question of what happens not only to their Spanish, so do you benefit from immersion? The previous slide that I showed you about study abroad experience suggests that study abroad is a good thing. But we wanted to ask what happens to their English. And so we used a set of different tasks, but I'm going to tell you about one today. And this is an example of something that's called a category fluency task. And again, it's a very simple task. We say, name as many words as you can think of in 30 seconds in a particular category. So I say fruit, and we don't actually show you pictures. I'm just illustrating this here. And you're going to say, you know, apple, pear, banana, mango. And then I say, okay, I want you to do that in your second language. Well, if you're a student who's studying the second language and you're not really proficient in the second language yet, which language is going to be more productive? Your native language. You know more words in your native language than in your second language. And in fact, that's what we found, and that's what we should have found. What's shown here on the left is English, on the right is Spanish. The black bars are the students who are immersed in study abroad. The white bars are the classroom learners who are at Penn State. If you look at the Spanish on the right, what we see is that the students who are studying abroad produce more Spanish than the students who are in the classroom. And that's a good thing. It means that this study abroad, this immersion is working. They are learning Spanish and they're increasing their ability to speak words in Spanish. But what happens when we look at the data on the left? The data on the left are in English, the native language of both groups. First, you see everybody produces more English because these are only intermediate learners and their English is their native language. So that makes sense. But what we see is the opposite for English. What we see is that for English, we see that the immersed students are actually producing less English than the students who are in the classroom, suggesting that there is a momentary suppression of their native language while they are studying abroad. It looks like English takes a hit. Now, taking a hit sounds like a bad thing, but I want to argue that taking a hit is not a bad thing. That speakers learn to control the two languages, excuse me, and that is a dynamic that we expect to see during language learning. What we know is that proficient bilinguals rarely make the error of speaking the wrong language, but they also, under some circumstances and for some bilingual groups, can code switch with one another, switching back and forth between the two languages. Well, we want to argue that each of those observations requires a very high level of control. Both languages are active, but you're not blurting out words in the wrong language. And at the same time, you can code switch going back and forth in this illustration in English and Spanish, and you can do that quite skillfully. And the claim that we want to make is you're able to do that because you've learned how to regulate your stronger, your native or dominant language. And what we really think is that code switching in particular may really be a very special bilingual skill, that code switching bilinguals have learned to dance with language. They can predict whether a code switch is coming up when they listen to language. When they produce in one language, they change their speech slightly in a way that accommodates the code switch. And so the hypothesis is all of this dancing with language, which seems rather complicated, may actually have some positive effects on cognitive processes. So far from having negative consequences, all of this language switching may really be good for the brain. So what is the consequence of all of this for the bilingual's brain, for cognition? The hypothesis is that juggling two languages that are constantly active may change the native language and tune the brain networks that enable this kind of what we call cognitive control or executive function. And I want to very briefly illustrate some of the studies that have shown exactly how that happens. This is a study, a brain imaging study from Jubin Abatolebi's lab in Milan. And what they did in this experiment was very, very simple. What you have on the right is something called the flanker task, which is a cognitive task where you have a set of arrows pointing either to the right or the left. And essentially, as a participant in this kind of experiment, you're sitting in front of a computer screen and you're playing something that's analogous. It's like doing a video game or a little parlor game. You just simply press a key to the right or left, depending on which direction the arrow is pointing. And what we can do is sometimes the arrow is pointing to the right, and all the other arrows are going to be pointing in the same direction with that arrow. Other times, we can introduce other information, like arrows pointing to the left when the critical arrow is pointing to the right. And so what happens is that when you have a conflict, people typically experience some interference. They experience some interference when there's a conflict between what they have to respond and the direction of the information they see. Everybody shows sensitivity to that conflict, whether you're bilingual or whether you're monolingual. But here's what was found. So this is a brain imaging study where we're looking at activation. We're looking at activation in the area of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. This is an area of the brain that's been implicated in monitoring conflict between different conditions. Do you see how the monolinguals have a lot of activation, those bright yellow circles, whereas the bilinguals have small little sort of red-yellow activation? Okay, so what's happening? Both the bilinguals and the monolinguals are using the very same area of the brain to solve this problem. However, the bilinguals need less activation to solve the same problem. They need to use less of their brain to solve the very same conflict. And so the argument is that a life of resolving conflict across two languages essentially makes bilinguals expert in conflict resolution at this level. And what happens is that you can then extend those skills beyond language to more general cognitive problems and be more efficient. And hence the title of this paper, Bilingualism Tunes the ACC for Conflict Monitoring. Bilinguals become very skilled at monitoring conflict. And what we see that is very interesting is that these consequences increase as people get older. And so what we see is that when bilinguals have been bilingual for their entire life, that they may show this benefit of bilingualism in a very important way, so that it provides protection. And I always say when I show this picture that I'm not promoting smoking, but we can see that for someone to be able to maintain their cognitive functioning, even if it means lighting up a cigarette, what we have is we have a benefit of bilingualism, that bilingualism is thought to provide some protections against cognitive aging. Now, the most dramatic evidence of all in the literature concerns what happens to older adults who face pathology. Being bilingual does not prevent you from becoming demented. It does not prevent you from developing Alzheimer's disease. It does not prevent you from getting sick. However, the studies have shown that being bilingual provides protection against the symptoms of dementia. So bilinguals present with Alzheimer's symptoms at about 4 to 5 years later than monolinguals. The area of the brain that's being affected is not the area of the brain that's involved in the actual disease itself. But what it is, it's a kind of, to say this loosely, a sort of mental muscle. It's as if the bilinguals have been in this mental gymnasium where their brains are in really good shape. So just as a person who's in very good physical condition may be better able to withstand a physical insult or physical injury, bilinguals seem to be able to withstand this kind of mental injury, so that in fact they can compensate for the symptoms of dementia for much longer. So the bilingual seems to be a mental juggler. We're at a very, very early stage of understanding all of the factors that characterize bilingualism in this way and that allow us to predict exactly what the consequences might be. We need to be modest. There is a great deal we do not know. But we also need not to wait to begin to bridge the gap between what we do know and practice. So we need to take the studies from academic journals, from academic results, and begin to say, what does this mean for parents raising bilingual children? What does this mean in school contexts where children and adults are attempting to learn a second language? We need to use this sort of bridge to counter the mythology about bilingualism in this country and abroad. I want to briefly mention Bilingualism Matters. Antonella Sirachi is here at this meeting and we'll be talking about this in a lot of detail. I just want to mention very briefly, this is an organization that was founded by Antonella at the University of Edinburgh in 2008. There are now 18 branches, 3 of them in the US, and our branch at University of California, Riverside is the most recent branch as of October 2017. And the goal is to create partnerships with the community. It's not just about our bringing the research to the public, it's also about those of us who do research understanding what the needs are in the public, how language is actually used in the community, whether it be for parents raising bilingual children, for educators in school systems making decisions about dual language instruction, or for government policy makers. So we are very proud and excited to have this branch of Bilingualism Matters and to now begin to reach out here in Southern California where bilingualism really does matter and where we have a very linguistically diverse community. And I just want to say very briefly, and my guess is that Antonella will talk about this in much more detail, that if we return to the myths that I raised earlier in the talk, I think we can argue that the research shows pretty clearly that they are myths. Exposure to 2 languages does not confuse infants. In fact, to the contrary, exposure to 2 languages from birth enhances infants' ability to keep their language system open to new languages and to speech in general. Mixing language is a sign of low proficiency and perhaps pathology, as I mentioned a moment ago. Research on code switching suggests that code switching may actually be a form of bilingual athleticism, and that it may provide bilinguals with a number of distinct advantages. Children raised in with a home language other than English should be switched to English as quickly as possible. Not true. You saw the graph earlier from the American Association for the totally missing the AAA. There are 2 AAASs. There's the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and then there's the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's the latter here. The data there show that dual language education is really provides some very clear benefits. So the home language should be maintained, but the home language, maintaining the home language and reinforcing that maintenance when children enter school is a positive thing. The human brain evolved to speak 1 language? Absolutely not. There's no evidence that that's true. It's not a complication to speak a second language. Studying a foreign language is a waste of time? Absolutely not true. Even late second language learners may differ from bilinguals in some ways, but it's never too late and never too late to derive many of the associated benefits. And so just to wrap up, how can we embrace bilingualism, language learning, and study abroad as a source of engaged scholarship for university students, to the extent that in the United States we see a very low level of language attainment in primary and secondary school. Those of us who are involved in university education really need to be thinking about how we can address this. And we saw in the data that I presented earlier from the American Academy that there are some real benefits to study abroad, and we've been researching some of the basis of that. And another thing that we can do is to think about how to provide a more diverse set of opportunities for university students to experience research and study abroad. So most experiences abroad are study abroad where a student goes to take classes. At Penn State and now at University of California, Riverside, we have a very wonderful grant from the National Science Foundation called Partnerships for International Research and Education, where we are funded to train undergraduates and graduate students to conduct research and then to take that research abroad in partnership with individuals in many different places in the world as a way of conducting research on language and learning and bilingualism in a very broad context. This PIRE grant creates a program of translational research in diverse contexts, looking at it across the entire lifespan from infancy to old age, to use a range of different methodologies, and to look at different contexts, because in different places in the world, bilingualism and second language learning take different forms. It's very critical to have a comprehensive account that we can really understand how it differs and what the implications may be for learning in these different contexts. So together, we can build partnerships between research and both local and global communities to encourage language learning in the US, and that is our goal. So I just want to end by acknowledging that I have many, many collaborators, including students and former students and colleagues across the world. When you're in the United States, as you've seen from the situation that I've depicted, if you want to do research on bilingualism, you need to have many generous colleagues who work with you and where you can work with them in different places in the world, and funding support both from the National Science Foundation and from National Institutes of Health, among others, and a very special acknowledgement to this international network for research on bilingualism and language learning that's been made possible by the NSF PIRE support. Thank you.